Welcome to Habitat Happy Hour, everyone. I'm Amy Nelson. I'm a member of the communications team here at Biohabitats. Thank you so much for joining episode 2 of our 3-part webinar series on how we can use ecology as a framework for the planning of resilient and biodiverse cities. In part 1, Jennifer Dowdell and Aiman Duckworth provided an overview of a process that they use to do this work. And in today's episode, they're going to delve more deeply into that process, specifically into the analysis of data and in the discovery of patterns and connections, and in the creation of future scenarios. And they have a lot to present, so I do want to hand it over to them quickly, but first, just to provide a little bit of background for those of you who weren't able to join us for episode 1, I will put in the chat window a link to a video of that episode so you can catch up on that. And then I wanted to introduce Jennifer and Aiman. Jennifer Dowdell is a senior ecological planner and designer at Biohabitats. And Jennifer's expertise is in weaving in principles of ecology into site design and master planning. Aiman Duckworth is a senior landscape architect and urban ecologist, and Aiman's expertise is in geospatial modeling. And I think in today's presentation, you'll see how Jennifer and Aiman have really been able to apply their areas of expertise to this work. If you have questions at any time during the presentation, you can ask them using the question box in your control panel. Jennifer and Aiman will answer some of those questions during the webinar, and then when their presentation is done, we hope to have plenty of time for Q&A, and they can address those that they hadn't addressed during the presentation. Hopefully you won't hear from me again until we're just about out of time, but thank you again for joining us, and Jennifer, I'm going to let you and Aiman take it away.
Thanks, Amy. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited to be here to share with you the second episode of our series on urban ecology framework planning. This one, we're going to be focusing on analysis and engagement and patterns and connections that we are finding through this work. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Aiman. So first, we want to take a moment to pause and acknowledge that we are gathering today on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples around the U.S. and beyond. I am here on the traditional homelands of the Susquehannock people of northern Chesapeake Bay. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. Their presence is continual on these lands and waters. So next slide, please, Amy. So as Amy mentioned, this is the second episode of 3 that we are doing to really pull apart and share our urban ecology framework planning process. This is an inclusive urban design process based on the braided narratives of ecology, history, and culture. And we're looking at all of this through the lens of landscape ecology and a foundation in community input that provides the keys to designing for tomorrow's resilient cities. So today is our second episode, and then we'll have our final episode in just a couple weeks at the beginning of June, focusing on implementation and next steps. Next slide, please. So as we started with the first session, we want to do a quick series of polling questions to get a sense of who's joining us today amongst you. So Amy, if you could pull up the first poll, we'll get right started on these. And what we'll ask is if you can identify what sector that you're coming from. Public sector, private sector, nonprofit, or none of the above. Last time we had a number of students join us, and we were really excited to have them with us, and we love to hear and see who's participating and joining us for this discussion. So we'll just give you another moment to finish answering the poll. And then we'll close it now, I think. So it looks like almost half of you are in the public sector, but we have a fair amount of people from private sector, nonprofits, and then a little bit of none of the above. All right, question number 2, please, Amy. So the second question is a yes or no. We're just interested in knowing if you're seeing an increased interest in resiliency planning from your constituents, colleagues, towns, councils, neighbors. So just up or down. Are you seeing resiliency as a key interest? We'll just give you another minute to finish adding your votes. All right, let's close this poll. It looks like we have a resounding majority of you who are seeing this increased interest in resiliency. We are too, and we think that this approach is really applicable to this. Okay, our final question. This is an interesting one. We want to ask you to answer whether or not, or which of these top priorities are defining local planning work where you are. And while there may be a multitude of these, we want you to just choose the one that is the top priority that's defining your local planning work. So we'll give you just a moment to finish answering this poll question. Looks like about half of you have answered thus far, so we'll give you just another moment. And we'll go ahead and close it now. We've got pretty good feedback there. So the results show a variety of priorities, which is what we expected. It does not surprise me that equity and access is one of the top priorities that's really showing, as well as environmental sustainability and economic development. And I think what we find important about the work that we're doing with this urban ecology framework planning approach is that it really does integrate all of these things. While we start with the lens of ecology and while we are integrating throughout with the community engagement, we are finding that all of these are addressed. So we're looking forward to sharing more with you today. So first, before Aiman gets into the deep dive of the analysis question of today, we want to just briefly review what we talked about last session for those of you who may not have been able to join us. So if Aiman, you can go to the next slide, please. So the socio-ecological approach to systems thinking is really grounded in these three areas of study: ecology, biodiversity, and systems thinking. And what we try to start to talk about is how are we defining these things, and how are they part of our conversation with the community from the very beginning. So yes, go ahead on that next slide, please. So we use a wide variety of data gathering techniques and engagement techniques with the community from the very beginning of this process to really help uncover people's relationship to nature, their stories of nature, their identity as it relates to nature in the city. So this is an intense gathering of data, of information, of sharing of stories in a variety of different contexts and forms. And then we can use that to inform the process as we move along through the study. So we're thinking of all the ways that people can share their thoughts, their emotional connections to nature, and how that can help inform how we progress in our process. So one of the forms that this took with our work in Atlanta was through audio stories, audio recordings that we could then have as a living archive of the stories and the relationships that the individuals who participated in these initial planning engagement activities were really able to identify and highlight for us. So Amy, if you could, we're going to pull up one of these audio links just to give you a taste of what we heard and what we were able to really embody through the process.
Nature is for me, it's a freeing, healing place. Sometimes when I have a lot to deal with, mentally, spiritually, I just go for a walk. Sometimes I'll walk through the city, and sometimes I'll walk through a park. Sometimes I'll walk straight through the woods. Sometimes I'll walk through the woods into another park, through a couple alleys and then into another park, like because Atlanta's set up that way. But what's cool about Atlanta is that you're never really too far from a patch of trees, a patch of grass. I don't know that healing, soothing factor would be the same if Atlanta was a strict concrete jungle. And I'm from Atlanta. And so I've always been able to do that my entire life. I've always been able to just go out, smell some grass, step into some soil, step in some dirt. You know what I mean? There's something different. You feel connected to something when you do that, and you feel connected to the rest of the world, and I think the rest of humanity, because when you step out, there's something about stepping onto soil that feels like you're standing on it with everybody else who's standing on soil somewhere. So.
Thank you, Amy. So we will share the screen again of the PowerPoint slides, but while Aiman is bringing that back up, I think what is so powerful about these audio stories that the community shared with us is that there is this very deep emotional connection and these very specific moments in experiencing nature that the community was able to share with us that allowed for us to have a variety of ways of thinking of what could we start to develop as a framework for moving through this process to further engage with them and to also start to document and use that documentation to inform the data analysis. So if we move to the next slide, what we were able to do is actually illustrate a lot of the feedback. So this slide shows the illustration of feedback that we received during the first engagement meetings in the city of Atlanta that really highlighted what the community identified as those areas of priority for preservation and protection, those areas of high quality, special experiences, those areas they wanted to keep center in this connection with how the planning framework moved forward. In the next slide, we also had the community talk to us about the risks. What were those things that were most likely to impact their connection to nature, and what should we be thinking about and addressing or trying to learn more about in our data analysis? So these are actual visualizations of the information the community shared with us in those varieties of meetings at the beginning. And then finally, this map on the next slide shows some themes that were developed, again, based on the community's engagement. They're drawing on maps and telling us these stories that helped us develop the vision and goals that would then help guide the rest of the planning process. So protect, green, connect. These were ideas and themes that stayed with us throughout this process. So this is just a reminder of what we talked about in the first session about really engaging that community group early and in a multitude of ways, and then allowing for those themes to travel with us throughout the process. So if we look at the next slide, this just reviews the process as a whole. It is a 6-step urban ecology framework planning process that we've developed and continue to evolve as we work with different communities. Last session, we looked at and really spent most of our attention on the first 2. Today, we're going to really spend all of our attention on these middle 2 steps. But of course, this whole process is very iterative. We're always kind of thinking back to what we learned in the early steps, continuing to check in with the community and share the results of what we're learning. So that is how we will develop the rest of today's discussion, focusing on these inner 2 steps on needs assessment and geospatial analysis. And then next, our final session will really focus in on the last 2 here. So with that, I'll hand it over to Aiman.
Thanks very much. All of our urban analysis is firmly rooted in the science of urban ecology, which can include an understanding of urban ecosystems that happen to be within the boundaries of cities, and has expanded in more recent years to include an understanding of an ecology of cities and an ecology for cities, an understanding of the city itself as an ecosystem, the relationship of social systems and ecological systems and their interactions. We also bring a rooting in the science of landscape ecology in urban areas. So an understanding of spatial pattern and how that relates to ecological function, and identification of important patches or contiguous areas of habitat, and then the corridors that are needed to connect them to maintain healthy systems. I'm going to briefly go through a regional example here with a regional green infrastructure framework for the Kansas City metro area, a 9-county area, and a development of a prioritization for conservation and restoration for the region. This analysis goes through a nested analysis at multiple scales. So on the left, at a regional scale of the 9 counties, we then zoomed in to identify priority watersheds. Within priority watersheds, identifying opportunity areas, and then within those opportunity areas, potential project sites for implementation to achieve the greater vision of the regional framework. So here an example of our regional analysis, again, 9 counties, about 4,500 square miles, an analysis that looked at aquatic resources, terrestrial resources, and then impacts to them. Then zooming in to look at watersheds and priority watersheds, we can layer in our understanding of the value of ecological resources, impacts and needs to them, and then also social needs, with the idea that if we find these interactions of multiple systems and multiple values and needs, we can suggest projects that when implemented might have the greatest benefit to the community and the ecosystems at large. And then within these watersheds and opportunity areas, helping translate these greater concepts into design and practices with typical implementation practices and also specific project recommendations. And then it also includes a set of policy recommendations, looking regionally to find best practices within the region that could be applied to other counties or other municipalities, and then also making recommendations from some national approaches on how to best achieve the goals and values of the regional green infrastructure framework. I'm going to talk now in some more detail and get into a little bit of more of the nuts and bolts of the analysis for some work that we did for the city of Atlanta. So the city by 2040, the region of Atlanta is expected to nearly triple in population within the next 2 decades. So you can imagine the significant amount of change that will bring to the region and to the city of Atlanta. And the framework helps guide that new density of development while also laying out a vision to protect, restore, and enhance the ecological resources of the city. On the left, building on the goals and values of the plan of protection, equity, multifunctionality, and stewardship, we developed an analysis in 4 categories: habitat and biodiversity, ecosystem services, parks and open space, and environmental and climate justice. Often habitat and biodiversity is considered an ecosystem service, and it certainly underpins all the services that nature provides to us. But we've separated it out here as its own analysis to recognize the importance of habitat and biodiversity, irrespective of the services that it provides to humans. The city of Atlanta has a very high tree canopy total in comparison to other major cities in the United States. And it's becoming more frequently applied for larger and smaller cities to look at a tree canopy analysis and set tree canopy goals, and looking at kind of just total percentage of canopy in the city as an understanding and a metric for success in their urban ecosystems. And with our analysis, we want to drill down even farther and apply these urban ecology and landscape ecology principles to understand, well, what is the actual function of different urban forests, understanding that large contiguous areas of habitat serve very different functions and have very different values than individual street trees or residential trees and lawn areas. And so to support that kind of analysis, I'm going to just show you an example of just some of the data inputs that we used for our spatial analysis. So here, a high resolution land cover, which is very important in urban areas to pick out the detail of urban patterns and potential ecosystem fragmentation. This was the analysis that we applied here was previously existing and done by Georgia Tech. It's becoming more and more frequent that for municipalities that were also generating land cover from publicly available sources and then using that as the data input for the analysis that we do. The city also had an existing iTree study, and so hundreds of plots across the city supported and conducted by the U.S. Forest Service to understand in more detail what specifically is happening in those sample areas of urban forest. We also drew on a number of community science species observations, so including data sources such as eBird and iNaturalist, also some state level Department of Natural Resources observations that identified sensitive species area concerns. And these and a number of other data inputs were combined into a series of metrics that we then layer together to look at habitat and biodiversity. So one of them being uniqueness. And so here in this map and all the others that follow, a darker green is going to indicate a higher value in that metric. And so uniqueness includes things such as high conservation priority species for the state and for the region and the territory that supports them within these urban areas, mature forest, interior forest, patches of forest that are housing city champion trees. For this metric, we're able to draw on existing historic aerials and USGS topo, and then extract an understanding of where is the highest likelihood of some of the oldest forests in the city located, with the understanding that these remnant areas of mature forest are going to provide significantly different ecological functions than some of the other younger forests throughout the city. We also see things such as forest patch size, with larger contiguous areas being strongly associated with areas of high biodiversity. Vertical diversity, so here an understanding that a multi-layered mature forest is going to have a different ecological function than residential trees and lawn or other different conditions of forest structure. We also looked at aquatic and riparian resources, and also soils. And through evaluation of these and then a weighting, we stack these together to create a summary analysis of habitat and biodiversity. So here in dark green, showing areas that are based on the data and the analysis are having a highest likelihood of having high biodiversity presence and habitat value for the city. And then we can take that analysis, and then here we're clipping it to just the areas of the city that are currently directly protected in some format. So parks, conservation easements, and you can see some areas are captured, particularly in the Southwest. But then if you look in contrast to areas that aren't protected, significant areas of high habitat value throughout the city that are not currently under a form of direct protection. We can also look at data from building permits in recent years, so quantities and densities of recent development to understand, well, in the near term, which of these areas of high biodiversity value may be most at threat from development. And then we can also look at a longer term. This is showing the city planning's areas of planned increase in density in the city. Now, a lot of this increase in density was concentrated in areas that are already developed or areas of existing development corridors that could continue to be increased in density. So you can see in a number of ways, because of those characteristics and because of their previous planning, they've done a pretty good job in identifying where existing or future density might happen. But you can see particularly throughout the South and from some other analyses that I'll show in a moment, there were some significant recommendations that came from our work that would help fine tune this vision. And we also looked at streams, so an understanding of the stream resources themselves from data from the Department of Watershed Management, and understanding of stream buffers, the watershed area characteristics that are contributing to these streams to help identify their likely current conditions, and then which might be in need of greatest protection or restoration. So through this process, we in some ways discovered or rediscovered with city planning and with the community areas of mature, large, contiguous forest, which are very important for a number of species, including that are present in urban environments. Here, just by example, the wood thrush and the brown creeper, a number of species that require these conditions of larger contiguous habitat, and then also require connectivity between these habitat areas. So they may exist, but if they're fragmented and completely isolated from development, the health of those species and the populations of those species will decline over the long term. And these species of birds shown here on the screen and many others are on a list of species that are in past years have been very common, but are now, because of development and significant fragmentation, in a state of fairly steep decline nationally. So to look at habitat connectivity and connectivity between these areas of high habitat importance, we took a step back and looked at regional connectivity, looked at a number of existing studies that looked at larger regional areas to understand, well, how does Atlanta fit within the greater context of needs and current presence of habitat connectivity? And then we zoomed in at high resolution to the city itself and conducted our own habitat connectivity analysis. So what you're seeing on the screen here in blue-green are some of those areas that we identified as being important, large, contiguous habitat areas. And then in the red to green ranges, we're identifying and then modeling areas of different resistance to movement between those habitat areas. So we're identifying the habitat and then trying to understand, well, how can different species move between them, with the idea that in the dark red lines you see crossing there, that 4-lane highways are going to have a significantly different barrier to movement than residential yards or than smaller habitat patches throughout the city. And so by applying different forms of modeling, here's an example of some of the outputs we get, and then I'll show you how they translated into our planning work. So what you're seeing here again in green, those green patches are the important habitat patches. The diffuse blue-green models throughout the entire urban fabric how much movement is likely from the modeling for the species. So darker greens are areas of more concentrated movement, ranging to lighter greens to areas that are white where there are significant barriers and there isn't much movement or value to habitat connectivity at all. And the bright green lines that connect to the various patches are showing, well, if you restricted that movement to just a single narrow corridor, which will be the most important for movement? And that helps us focus our recommendations. And this kind of analysis can also help us identify where are areas that might be most important to restore to help increase connectivity between these existing areas of important habitat. And so this summarizes some of those outputs. Again, you can see the blue-green important habitat patches, the bright green corridors, and then the tones of greens to yellows to browns are showing at the watershed scale, summarizing by sub-watersheds, how much connectivity movement is happening between them. So we can look and understand at the city scale where are areas that are most important to movement, and then where are existing barriers that might be important to address to help increase movement and habitat health. So then zooming in, here in the black crosshatch is an overlay of that area of planned density that I mentioned before. And so the areas circled in red are identifying areas where, while there may not have been existing high value habitat, that high value habitat existed elsewhere in the city, and it's incredibly important for that connectivity to happen across these areas of planned future development. So this helps us identify areas where we might need to make some additional recommendations for that future plan of density increase and development. We also looked at ecosystem services, and I don't have time to mention them briefly, but you're seeing here a map of existing carbon storage within the city, both above and below ground. And then we also looked at flood mitigation, water purification, needs related to temperature regulation, and particulate air pollution. We also looked at open space access. So here shown in red are areas that are defined as park desert. And so here we're identifying areas that are beyond a 10-minute walk for residents of the city. And so that looks at specific data for where people can enter parks, what's really happening on the street, what's happening with the sidewalk. So it's modeling how people can actually move through the city, and then where it's beyond a 10-minute walk for them to reach a public open space. This looks at park deserts, but applies them to where is a park desert for what we're calling a high biodiversity park. So you may have access to a public plaza that counts as a park, but it may not be an area of high urban nature value. Recognizing that there are different types of parks, and then here's another layer of parks that may need to be understood and potentially provide access to greater areas of high biodiversity for some residents of the city. We also looked at a park diversity of access. So this recognizes again that a nature center and a rec center and a playground are all very different. And so here in shades of purple, with the darkest purple is showing areas where residents have access to the greatest diversity of parks. So it's important to recognize that you may have access to one type of park, but the urban environment requires a diversity of public open spaces. And we're helping identify not just where people can't get to any park, but where they might need additional variety and diversity of public open space value. Here is looking at park deserts and then intersecting that with their areas of high biodiversity from our previous analysis to understand where might be potential locations to create new parks that could preserve habitat and also provide important access to public open space and urban nature for residents of the city. We also looked at environmental and climate justice, and as one lens to apply an analysis and understanding of that, we applied a social vulnerability index review. And so a social vulnerability index is helping to identify through various demographic characteristics populations where a lack of access to resources is going to have a greater impact to those populations. And these people may also be typically historically disenfranchised or underserved within urban environments. And so those include a look at socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, and also housing and transportation, with the understanding that if someone doesn't have access to good public transportation or access to their own vehicle, there may be parks in the city, there may be plenty of them, but there may be populations of people who don't have the ability to have access to the resources that those public open spaces provide. And so with this lens, we can then go back through some of the other analyses. So here, looking at park deserts, but then in the darkest red showing areas of highest social vulnerability. So we can see where there may be park needs, but then there may be populations of people within those deserts that have the greatest need for these resources and less access to them throughout the city, that may be then the highest priority of where change might need to happen for increase in parks throughout the city. This is looking just generally at tree canopy and neighborhoods, identifying neighborhoods with low tree canopy that also have high social vulnerability. We also looked at heat islands, so the significant increase in urban temperatures that can also have greatest impact to certain populations that are indicated in the social vulnerability index, and who also may be at greatest threat to the impacts that climate change will continue to exacerbate for urban heat islands, particularly here in the southeast of the United States. And then we also looked at air pollution and areas of where people may need the greatest access to amelioration of high particulate air pollution in the city. And so from these analyses, we can start to identify citywide areas of greatest protection priority, areas of greatest restoration priority. We can look again in more detail at these areas of planned density and start to identify where those pinch points or potential areas of conflict might be, and then make recommendations for how that development might be treated differently to allow for connectivity and the benefits and resources that it provides. We can also look at potential areas to increase tree canopy. And so you can see there's a significant mosaic throughout the city of possible areas to increase the tree canopy and the benefits that provides for the city. And then the red areas are showing specifically where those potential opportunities overlap with our restoration priority. So here you may be serving multiple functions with increase in tree canopy in those areas in particular. This looks specifically at street right-of-way. And so where are opportunities within that street right-of-way to expand, identifying areas in red and orange and yellow that should receive the greatest prioritization for expansion of tree canopy within the right-of-way and the attendant benefits that provides to the community and to the greater habitat in the city. We can also go back to this concept of in tree canopy goals and the goals to preserve, but then also increase tree canopy in urban areas and do a more refined, spatially explicit understanding of what might those goals need to be in different areas of the city. So looking at the available planting area analysis that I showed you previously, and then we can also look at past trends in tree canopy change, existing zoning, land use patterns, and then create some customizable goals for what is both realistic, but then what might also be needed to meet the needs of the city, with the understanding that a dense urban downtown is going to have a different potential ability to expand its tree canopy in comparison to some areas that might be more on the fringes of the city. And it's important to note that the data and these analyses don't tell the whole story of our understanding of the city. The voice and the input of the community is vital to this type of planning and these analyses. And so here's an example of a web map, an example of some analysis and some mapping posted where people can access it publicly and then identify areas of concern for residents, areas of value, and then make specific notes of what's happening within their neighborhood that they think is important. And then this type of data can be fed back into our analysis to update and continue to refine things. And then we can also share this analysis in more traditional ways through maps. face-to-face dialogue, getting people's input directly, through notation, through speaking with us, through putting post-it notes on maps and helping us understand and helping each other understand what's happening in their city, with the intent always being that this process helps create an analysis and then a vision for the city that expresses the voice of the community.
The final part of this approach to understanding this iterative analysis and engagement is once we've shared all of these results with the community and we're starting to get further input, we have decided in some cases to begin to formulate what future scenarios. So what does the future start to look like if we start creating kind of plan views of change? And it's one way to kind of start to show what that change looks like and what changes in the landscape create in terms of opportunities. So we address a lot of what Aiman shared in terms of opportunities and barriers in a map form that we can then get further feedback from the community on what they see. So in the case of Atlanta, we developed a series of future scenarios to bring back to the community as a first effort at laying out some plans for the city. And what we did is we isolated different priorities and tried to show what an emphasis on each of the priorities would start to look like in the city. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So we had 4 future scenarios that we developed for Atlanta. And as you see with the graphic here on the right, it was about thinking about this wide dynamic of potentials for the future along this, and where could we kind of plug in different priorities. So the first future scenario really focused mainly on equity and access to address a lot of those social equity issues that came up as we started to see what came out of the data. The second one really then switched to emphasis on landscape ecology. The third was a blend of the two. And the fourth was about great infrastructure. There is this sector of the highways and road systems of Atlanta. And a lot of people said in the feedback initially, how do we green all of this great infrastructure? So those are the basis of the 4 themes that we then applied in sort of putting pen to paper, drawing some loose ideas, starting to plug in information in, and starting to see what that could look like for the future of the city of Atlanta. So if we're going to go through each of those very briefly to give you a taste of what these future scenarios play out with Atlanta and the data and input that we've gathered. So scenario 1 on the next slide, please, is this focus on equity and access. So really addressing a lot of what you saw from Aiman's results of urban heat islands, high air pollution areas, trying to address that with increased tree canopy and greening, and then really addressing this access, trying to ensure that all park deserts had new areas of access to open space, different types of parks. So that was what starts to look like a plan if the emphasis is on equity and access. The next one, or rather really quickly, I'll show you those 3 were sort of pulled apart so we could kind of delve deeper with the community, and then we put them all in one map. Now we can move to scenario 2, landscape ecology. The emphasis was really on all of that resulting data that we found from the biodiversity analysis and understanding these rich resources of rivers and streams, understanding the potential for increase in the riparian buffer, so the overall functionality of the habitat along those zones, and focusing on ecological protection and enhancement of the highest value areas of the city. So again, all of the focus in this particular scenario is on ecology, and we start to see these grander patterns and gestures across the landscape that can help feed and inspire everyone to think of the future and what could be for the city as a whole. The next scenario, I think briefly, there's just the 2 of those pieces broken out again. And then the third scenario is when we start to blend the 2. So here we're actually pulling together equity and ecology, starting to see how they speak to one another, how the 2 can help build and strengthen the ideas of both, and this pattern of interconnected open spaces and stronger ecological features. The final scenario, again, as I noted, was really focused on the highway situation. One individual actually said and drew in big green lines across the map in an early meeting, what if we just started greening all the roads? And there's a question there of what does that really mean, practically speaking? Are we putting big tree medians in our highways? Maybe. Are we looking to prioritize street tree canopy? Definitely. So this was just, again, this future what if we've put all of our resources into increasing tree canopy across the city on our major street network, as well as our blueways. There was interest in really thinking of the streams as another sort of connection and corridor network that could be increasingly thought as a way to move across the city. So those were those 4 scenarios that helped drive further communication with the community, further input into what really stood out to each of them as they looked at these scenarios, and how could all of that help build further excitement, support, and questions for the team as we continue to evolve the planning process with the city planning department. So that's sort of where we're going to stop in terms of today's discussion, but I want to give you a brief sneak peek into what we will then focus on in the 3rd session. So in Baltimore, we had the opportunity to look at the data analysis and understand the potential for change in using the vacant lots as a starting point for building a stronger green network. So as I introduced, I think in the first session, there's a variety of vacant lots, 30,000 or so lots and buildings across the city, with some areas of dense areas of vacancy. So then in the next slide, we started to map both the historic ecological patterns that still have some resonance in the landscape, and the existing green network here on the right-hand side, and how those two overlay, and where we start to see areas where we could reconnect historic corridors perhaps that had been broken over time. That was one level of our initial analysis. You can go to the next slide. We then did a series of site suitability analyses, really starting to pull apart, well, where and what are the suitable opportunities for creating a green network to reconnect Baltimore City, to create opportunities for revitalization in neighborhoods, economic development, and greening. And so we use lots of different data to start to bring all of those ideas together. If we go to the next slide, we further looked at the opportunity to prioritize locations across the city that can help inform the building of corridors and nodes to create a green network. And through all of this, again, we're thinking both of the community needs that were expressed in the early engagement meetings and the resources that we were finding available and opportunities through this data analysis, looking for opportunities to increase habitat, corridor connectivity, et cetera. So what was interesting about the Baltimore City example, and part of what we'll dig deeper into in our next session, is the opportunity to really start to look at the neighborhood scale, at potential design of some of the spaces that were identified as key opportunities for green network nodes. So if we go to the next slide, please. There was this overlay that we did that allowed us to see some hot spots where there were definitely some opportunities of dense areas of vacant lots and buildings that stood at points where the legacy green network could be reintroduced and help connect the existing green network. So working with city planning department, if we go to the next slide, these hotspots overlaid particularly with certain neighborhoods and regions or zones across the city that the city noted as focus areas of further engagement. The city planning department in Baltimore has a long and deep relationship through their planning department with each of these neighborhoods. And so there was a way to get into the neighborhoods and get on the ground with neighbors to look at specific sites that had been identified through our analysis and start to design them in more detail, relying on understanding exactly what they needed, sometimes to the specifics of a certain playground that they wanted to see built in their neighborhood. So next session, we'll dig deeper into how we start to develop pilot projects and the opportunity for real implementation potential in the neighborhoods based on this big process. So jumping from different scales of regional landscape ecology to the city scale approach, all the way down to the neighborhood, to make sure that this plan isn't just a plan that sits on the shelf, but becomes a living element in the city's future for planning for resilience. So with that, if we can go to the next and final slide, just to recap, these are the focus areas that we'll talk about next week. The urban planning process, on the next slide, please, is the 6-step process. So again, we started with the first 2 last session, and then this session we really focus on the second 2 steps of this process. And in our 3rd session at the beginning of June, we'll dig deeper into this idea of creating pilot projects, exploring what it means to really plan for implementation and funding opportunities, and revealing the final urban ecology framework plans and green network plans that we worked on with these clients in a variety of cities. So with that, we finished our part of this discussion, but we are looking forward to answering some of your questions. So Aiman, if you can pop back on. And I'm going to just see if we have any other questions that Aiman hasn't answered in the chat yet.
Yeah, I can field one here for us.
Sure.
So the question is if we know if there are plans for street calming and incorporating more walkable infrastructure for the city of Atlanta. And then maybe you can say a word about how, you know, how that kind of public infrastructure, you know, related to some of the analysis that we did and the recommendations we made.
I do not recall if there are plans for street calming. I do believe that the Watershed Management Group was working on some green infrastructure applications in street calming. And I believe some of the plans that we looked at when we were getting into the final sort of implementation opportunities in the Atlanta project, we did look at some different kind of design options for streetscapes, and some of them included increased tree canopy that would, in essence, I think if they were in medians, help with traffic calming in some of the applications. There was also, I think, some interest generally in more walkable infrastructure across Atlanta. When we started our work, they had just started getting a lot of the scooters and the electric bikes. So there was a lot more interest in understanding how to make sure all of those individuals were safe in moving across the city. I don't know if, Aiman, you recall anything else from our work there.
Yeah, I think I can also add that you know there was some work and analysis and planning recommendations that we made that also related to trails and greenways and bike networks. And so I think there's a pretty active community there, as as in many urban environments, of interested in increasing bikeability of streets and connectivity there. So I think some momentum happening, and then hopefully in trying to implement some of the trail and bikeway expansion from the framework that that will continue to build some momentum for some of the traffic calming measures and connectivity measures in the transportation system.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question here. Can you discuss the role that creativity plays in the ecological planning process and engagement? I don't know, Aiman, you want to start and I'll finish? Looks like we're getting close on time. I see Amy have popped up.
Sure. Well, I think certainly in in the visioning and the understanding of how this translates to reality, a lot of the analyses we showed are kind of citywide, plan-based. There's data that might be representing things in multiple dimensions, but we're kind of presenting some plan-based citywide analysis that helps us focus in on areas. But I think you'll see, in particular when Jennifer talks in the next session about translating this to vision on the ground and experience of people through space, that kind of bringing the full framework to life through those methods will employ a significant amount of creativity and some more traditional urban planning and landscape architectural skills and modes of creativity.
Absolutely. And I think we invited folks to be very sort of big in their visions when we presented the alternative scenarios. We had these big printouts, and, you know, we as landscape architects trained in that, we're very excited to jump on top of a plan and draw all over it. And some folks are not as excited or as comfortable with that. So we tried to find a variety of ways to open up comfort levels, so they didn't have to draw if they didn't want to, but could kind of share their ideas, but they could draw. And we had some great scribbles and cartoons that came up, both in those early engagement activities with the whiteboard activity that we had, as well as the mapping activity. And the scenarios, frankly, was a way for us, I think, to feel like we could really test our creative juices. We did a lot of overlays just on scratch paper, and tried to think really big. Like, what does it mean if we rethink this city in a major way, knowing what defines it, and its unique character and its culture and community and its ecology, but how do we also find a way to reinforce that in a new and big gesture? So I think it plays it into all parts of this.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add a note and a pitch for you know, some of the analytical creativity also in some of what we presented today, with the idea that, you know, we're generally trying to, you know, there's goals for the project, there's analytical questions that we have, and there's always this kind of dance between, you know, what the questions we're trying to answer, the data that's available, how we can combine them in kind of creative and forward-thinking ways to explore some of this analysis and provide answers to some of the questions that will help support the vision that we're trying to achieve.
Aiman, I typically don't butt in until we are out of time, and we still have plenty of time for questions, but I actually had a question. I was wondering if, after doing all of this analysis, did the city or the community see the city in a new way or a different way? Were there any aha moments that are worth sharing?
Yeah, you know, in one, you know, I think maybe a couple that I can remember in particular, you know, some of the analysis that we did, you know, I mentioned before this idea of discovery or rediscovery of some of these important habitat areas. So I think there were significant, you know, existing urban forests that were maybe very known to the people directly in that neighborhood, but less understood in their importance citywide. And so there was this, you know, I think what the planning department was hearing, and, you know, what was coming out in some earlier community meetings, was the idea of that, you know, there's so much forest canopy in the north of the city where there's less dense residential areas, and that's, you know, likely going to arise as a, you know, high need for target, and that for targeting protection and restoration, and that's a, you know, a very important area for habitat for the city. And then what our analysis helped show was that there was a lot of going on in other areas of the city that maybe hadn't been heard from citywide, that would be important to protect and enhance. And in some ways, there was a bit of this north-south divide of where the attention was, and we were discovering a lot of important habitat, but then connectivity areas in the south. And in some ways, those paralleled some very different demographic you know, divisions within the city. So I think that helped, you know, helped layer in some important light to other neighborhoods in the city. And then I also think there was this notion of, well, maybe there are areas of the city that don't have access to parks, but maybe there aren't a whole lot of people there, or, you know, maybe the population density is low, so we're not missing as many people. But, you know, I think our analysis helped show that not only were there communities of, you know, that historically may have been disenfranchised and of high social vulnerability categories, but that there were also, in some areas, significant populations of those people. So, you know, a core constituency of folks that definitely had some significant needs for their public open space to be access to be increased.
We had another question, Aiman, about relative accessibility or affordability of tree canopy analysis and suggestions on service providers for photo analysis and data associated with aerial photos, our historical photos. I responded, you know, that the U.S. Forest Service, of course, does the U-Forest studies, but maybe you could expand on that a little bit with regard to other data sources for tree canopy analysis.
Sure. I mean, I think the main thing we're finding, and, you know, most cities are facing this question that we're working with of, well, do we want to do an iTree study and then do the summer of plots, and how much that's going to take in terms of resources and time and money, or do we want to try to generate this remotely sensed tree canopy? And then what I'm finding is there's the National Agricultural Imagery Program, which in recent years now has the full imagery bands that allow you to extract urban tree canopy. So with someone with the right expertise, that can be a fairly efficient process of at least taking an initial look at what's happening with tree canopy in cities. That's really taking publicly available aerial imagery and then putting it in the hands of someone that has the expertise to extract it. And I think the folks who are doing the GIS tools, Esri and others, I think that's becoming increasingly more accessible and understandable to get higher quality results from that. So, I think the accessibility point is increasing, and then I know some communities are also looking at, grant opportunities to use to generate a tree canopy study that can then support some of these other, whether it be stormwater management issues or equity issues that, there are some grant sources that we're seeing communities are starting to tap into to generate those kind of analyses.
Great, thank you, Aiman. So I had a question if we had another minute, since I don't see any more questions coming up. I wondered if, looking back, I think I have ideas, and I wonder if you have ideas, if there was anything that we would add to our analysis in Atlanta or Baltimore now that we're finished with it. If there's anything we felt like could continue to increase the value of that analysis as it could inform the planning process.
Sure. Well, I think, all of this work that we've done over the years, we kind of continue to evolve our process, and other folks are certainly doing that, and we're able to draw on those, resources that other colleagues or folks in research are generating. But I think, the kind of the process and understanding of calibrating these ecosystem service valuations and the data sources for those are continuing to increase. So I think there's opportunities to kind of make some of that work more vigorous. And then I think we're always interested in expanding as much as possible on this kind of multi-scalar approach. So I think whether we've been through this project, or I think some recommendations we would have for future iterations and future work, this work is done at very high resolution analysis that scales very well. You can kind of continue to zoom in, and if the quality of data is good, you can get into neighborhoods and smaller sub-watersheds and start to re-examine things with additional input from the data. So I think in ways that this work can kind of continue to live and grow, I think it would be zooming in at the neighborhood scale, and zooming it further. We did to some extent, but continuing to do that, let that process work its way through the city, through different neighborhoods, through different watersheds, perhaps in some of the ways from the Baltimore example that you mentioned, and that you'll talk about more in episode 2 of how do we zoom into the neighborhood scale and start to translate that into beneficial transformation for for the ecological systems, and also for the people and the communities that are living there.
So now we really are just about out of time. I wanted to thank Jennifer and Aiman for great presentations, so interesting, and thank all of you for joining us today. I would love to see everyone back on June 2nd for episode 3. I've put a link in the chat box, and in the follow-up email that you'll receive from me, which will have a video of this presentation, there will also be some information about how you can register for episode 3. For those of you who, like me, are in the Maryland area, I hope that you're able to marvel at, and rather than be grossed out by the cicadas. And I hope that everybody has a great evening, and hope you're all well, and look forward to seeing you back for the next happy hour. Thank you.